Hi, I'm here with Dr. NIK, youth specialist, and we'll be talking about the adolescent journey. Thank you so much for joining us here, NIK.
It's good to be here.
So, growing up, becoming an adult involves much more than growing up physically. It's also a maturing process as well.
Yes.
So what has to happen for a child to become an adult?
That's a good question. And I normally start my presentations by asking the adults in the room, how many of you think you're adults? And the people put their hands up and I say, so how do you know? And it's interesting to get the answers. Some people will say, well, I have children, I have grandchildren, I have grey hair, I'm paying my bills, I make my own decisions. There's lots of different answers that people give, and it begs the question, how do we actually define adulthood? And how do we determine who is an adult today? In the mind of every young person, a child, the journey towards adulthood involves a very important process that the Americans call individuation. In plain language, it means becoming your own person, becoming an individual. And that process of individuation involves three key tasks. The first task is to develop a sense of their own identity. Who am I? Every young person is asking that question, and as they grow up as children, that question is being defined for them by their environment. So if a young person grows up in a very warm, loving environment with parents who nurture them and give them value and affirm them, good nutrition, warm clothing, a nice caring environment, that person grows up thinking, I'm very secure, I'm loved, and I'm looking forward to going out into this big world. The second key task is for a young person to develop a sense of their own autonomy and purpose. That's a very key point as well, because a young person needs to know that their opinions have value, that they have value as a person. And so if they make a comment, is anybody listening to them? And if the caregivers around them, their parents or their family or their church, affirm them and love them, not necessarily always agree with them, but at least don't put them down or diminish them, then that person grows up knowing that when I say something, people are listening to me. And it's important for a young person to get that sense of personal power, or another word is agency, sense of personal agency. The third key task is to develop a healthy sense of belonging. Where do I belong? Where do I fit in? And we would like to think that in everyone's home, in their bedroom, in the lounge room, they're loved by their parents and their family. They love their parents love them, or their sole parent, or their grandparents. If they grow up knowing that they're cared for and loved in their home environment, they grow up with a healthy sense that I belong somewhere. We'd also like to think that it's the same in their church, that they grow up in their church and they're loved in their church. When they walk into Sabbath school, they're loved by their class members and they love them. And so all is well in their universe. Those three things are key for a young person to develop in terms of becoming a mature, functioning adult.
And that is quite an intense process. What happens if this journey is not managed well?
So if a young person grows up in a context where they're not necessarily given that love and that nurture, if that young person's journey involves pain or various kinds of abuse, whether it be neglect or emotional abuse or physical abuse, sexual abuse, a lot of pain, the young person grows up thinking, I'm not sure whether I belong. I don't know where I belong. I don't know where I fit in. I don't know who I am. I'm not quite sure whether I have any power. So that person grows up not as confident, not as willing to face the world in a positive way. And so that's not a good thing. We want our young people to grow up knowing that they are loved, that they have a sense of their own autonomy, and that they also have a place to belong.
And talking about timing and duration, how long does it take for this whole process to happen?
So in historically, we would say that adolescence begins at the onset of puberty, but it ends in culture, when the adult community see you as an adult, part of the adult community. So going back through history, the stats say that most children reach puberty in their mid-teens, 14, 15, internationally. Very quickly, they transitioned from being seen as a child to being a contributing member of an adult community. So, for example, a young boy, as soon as he reaches puberty and he's big enough to work with his father and strong enough, he would be out there helping his dad either on a farm or fishing or building, whether he's a carpenter or a stonemason or whatever trade the father was. For most of the history of the world, most boys followed their father's trade. So he would go from being a child to being an adult maybe within 2 years. Girls, similarly, once they were old enough to help their parents or their mother, they'd be working with their mum in a kitchen or maybe out in the farm in an agrarian context. So the transition from childhood to adulthood was very quick, maybe 18 months to 2 years. More recently, though, if you look at the stats now, children are reaching their puberty by the age of maybe 11 or 12 internationally. And there's reasons for that: better nutrition, more hormones in food, etc. But the age at which they're seen as an adult, fully functioning in their capacity as a contributing adult, has stretched right out into the early to mid-20s. And there's reasons for that as well. People are no longer compelled to get married in their teens in Western culture. In fact, most people now are choosing to get an education. So after the Second World War in Britain, only 3% of school leavers went to university. Today, it's more like 50 to 60% of young people are leaving school directly into a degree, 4-year degree. And now many people are also choosing to do a master's virtually straight after their undergrad degree. So you are seeing young people who aren't graduating until their early 20s, especially if they've taken a gap year or they've chosen to travel for a year or two. So they could be 23, 24 before they graduate and get their proper job and they're starting to financially contribute and become financially independent. So those two things are fairly key players. They're not getting married as early and they're not becoming financially independent as early. Of course, those who do trades leaving school will get their financial independence a lot earlier. But yeah, so there's this growing trend of people not seeing themselves necessarily as mature adults until their early to mid-20s.
Do you think that some of them still would like to continue being boys instead of feeling like grown men?
So there's a very popular culture today of, particularly with boys, being boyish. And it's not hard to see young boys or young men in their early to mid-20s with a skateboard under their arm and a pair of Vans shoes, playing and enjoying boyhood. In fact, a lot of boys are looking at the adult community saying, why would I want to go there? And so there's this almost a disincentive for people to become a card-carrying, contributing adult today. I mean, and I'm not saying that in a negative sense in that they don't want to be mature, but they don't necessarily buy into that traditional package of what being an adult means.
And what other factors do you think have contributed or have impacted the adolescents?
I think it's harder now for them. I know in America, a gentleman by the name of Dr. James Comer did some research looking at the skills required for an adolescent to make it into a corporate life today. And the skills required are on the increase. So higher levels of numeracy, literacy, computer skills, conflict management, a whole cache of skills you need to get the right mark at school, to get to the right university, to get to the right career. But what he noticed at the same time was that the amount of ongoing support that was being offered to a young person is on the decline. So the skills required are on an incline. The support being offered to the average adolescent is diminishing. So there's been this broadening gap between the skills that a young person needs to make it and the skills they're being offered by the community around them. And James Comer said that these two trends have created the crisis in America, and I think similarly it's happening here in Australia. Unemployment levels, in Australia might be around 7%, but for those under the age of 25, it doubles. So the average under 25-year-old is 14% of them are unemployed. So it's not as easy as it used to be to get a good job.
So how can we help them? I think this is the most important question.
So in simple terms, what can we do to offer to help them? Two things. First thing is social capital. Social capital is any form of support and love that we can invest in a young person. So sitting down beside a young person after school or at church, just asking them simple questions. How are you? How did you go at school today? How was uni? Did you do any good in your tests? What did you do over Christmas? Just showing them that you're interested in them, that you know their name, that you are familiar with their journey and you believe in them as a young person. That's very valuable to a young person. That's good news for a young person, to know that there's adults around who actually care for them. We call that social capital. That any investment we can give them. The second one is social scaffolding. Social scaffolding is any skill or talent or giftedness that we can invest in a young person. Right from childhood, how to clean your teeth, how to do your shoelaces up, how to put dishes back in the dishwasher or up on the kitchen bench, how to clean up after yourself, going right through to young people in their teens. How do you apply for a job? How do you fill out a tax return? How do you use a map and compass? How do you put up a tent? How do you learn to cook? All of those skills and talents that you give a young person help them to be confident when they reach their late teens and early 20s. So this is where things like pathfinding and adventuring add incredible gifts. It's a great cache of skills and talents we invest in young people and give them as young people. The most important part of these clubs, of course, is the fact that there's these parents and adults spending a long time with them and loving them. So the most valuable aspect of, say, pathfinders or adventurers is the ongoing journey they have with an adult who cares about them. Those two things are critical.
That's really important.
There's been a lot of study on this, and there's a direct correlation. The more social capital, the more social scaffolding a young person has, the lower the risk of at-risk behaviour. The less social capital and social scaffolding, the higher levels of at-risk behaviour in a young person. So in a nutshell, if you want to help them spend quality time with a young person, invest in them, teach them things. And you don't have to be young to do that. You don't have to be cool. You can be a grandparent, you can be a parent, you can be a retired accountant, but teach young people some skills.
And it's about relationship as well.
And build that relationship, yeah.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was excellent.